Going to continue reading part 3 of chapter 10 of Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology on the topic of the Great Diffusion. And this time we're going to be reading the first part of the northeastward diffusion. 1. The Basal Neolithic. The Bronze Age was already in full flower in Crete, Egypt, and Mesopotamia when the elements of the Basal Neolithic reached the Far East. A coarse, unglazed pottery shaped by hand by a coiling process and decorated with impressions or with lumps and strips of clay stuck on before firing is the characteristic sign of this earliest northeastern stratum of diffusion. The dwellings were sometimes built on piles along the waterways, reminding us of the pile dwellings of the Swiss lakes, and a kind of millet was the basic crop, again reminding us of the Swiss lakes. But in the earliest stages, no signs of cattle, sheep, or goats appear, the dog and pig being the only domesticated beasts. And even later, when cattle were introduced, pigs continued to preponderate. Oswald Mengem, therefore, has proposed that western China may have been the initial center of swine herding, which then would have been diffused in two directions, southeastward to Indochina, Indonesia, Melanesia, and from Indochina westward into India, and directly westward into Europe, the Near East, and Africa. However, the very early appearance of the pig in the Near East is the earliest Proto- and Basal Neolithic strata makes it difficult to imagine how the relationship of such a Chinese origin to the early Western data might be interpreted. Heingeldern links the herding of swine to the Basal Neolithic of the Near East, while Jensen, as we have already seen, associates the pig with the earliest planting cultures of the tropical zone. Apparently, all that is certain is that the beast appears throughout the whole extent of the Basal Neolithic, whereas sheep, goats, and cattle enter into the northeastward province of this broad domain only centuries later. That in the rites of Persephone and Demeter, as well as in the myths of Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, and Osiris, the legends of Odysseus and Circe, and Irish fairy lore, the pig and wild boar appear in roles that suggest a very early association with themes that were later adjusted to the cattle herding complex. That in China and Southeast Asia, the pig remained important even after cattle had been introduced, and that throughout Oceania, the role of the pig in both ritual and myth is of supreme moment. Professor Heingeldern has suggested, with a magnificently organized assemblage of evidence, that this basal Neolithic complex of the Far East, the place of origin of which has not been definitely fixed, though it would seem sensible to place it, provisionally at least, in the Afro-Asiatic Near East, as suggested in section 1 of this chapter, reached the Pacific by way of China and Japan, then spread southward across Formosa, the Philippines, Celebes, and Moluccas to New Guinea and Melanesia, and even touched finally the primitive Australians and, as shown earlier, the Andamanese. Its form of boat was the plank boat, with no outriggers, and its characteristic ground acts as a roughly ovoid cylindrical type. Many signs exist throughout the area of an early matriarchal social organization, with female shamans and perhaps even female rulers, while among the mythological and ritual motifs that were almost certainly associated with this Far Eastern Basal Neolithic complex are the immolated maiden and the fire goddess. Society in the Far East during the New Stone Age, as Professor Carl W. Bishop has observed, seems indeed to have borne a decidedly feminine cast. However, all consideration of the Proto and Basal Neolithic of the Far East is rendered difficult. First, by the paucity of archaeological material from the provinces in question, and second, by the vivid character of the bit that we have recently learned concerning the period immediately subsequent to the Basal, when a powerful high Neolithic center suddenly burst into view in the western provinces of China, largely influenced by a cultural impact from the southeast European Danube-Dniester zone. And we'll pick that up next time.